Hey guys! Tonight we slip barefoot into cool river mud, where moonlight turns the canals into silver ribbons, and the reeds whisper like they're sharing secrets you were never supposed to hear. You can almost smell damp clay drying on warm brick, and you can hear a distant fan-like hum in your own room, blending perfectly with the imagined night insects of ancient Mesopotamia. We're going to explore a story that might feel like history in one moment, and like a strange dream in the next. The idea that the Anunnaki created humans twice, and that the first version was erased. Some parts are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some are calm. What if imagination will keep the solid ground separate from the mist? The texts might suggest certain patterns. Historians debate meanings. And your brain will try to connect dots like it's doing a puzzle at 2A. Also, you probably won't survive this, meaning you won't survive staying awake, because I'm absolutely aiming to knock you out with relaxing lore. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and your local time in the comments, because I love seeing how far this bedtime history signal reaches. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing beside a canal that doesn't look accidental. Its banks are cut and packed, the water guided with quiet authority. Most historians agree that the southern Mesopotamia depended on irrigation, with canals turning a dry landscape into something capable of feeding cities. You watch the water slide by, carrying tiny flecks of silt like drifting thoughts. The air is warm, even at night, and the stars overhead feel close, as if you could scoop them up in a bowl made of clay. A small settlement lies nearby, low and wide, built from mud brick that holds the day's heat and releases it slowly, like a gentle radiator. Somewhere. A dog barks once, and then decides it's not worth the effort. You understand that life here is measured in grain, water, and labor. You also understand, with a slow, sleepy clarity, why stories about creation would grow in a place where everything is made by hand, and everything begins with mud. You crouch and press your fingers into the bank. The clay yields, cool and silky. It keeps your fingerprints. A perfect little record. That's the first quiet idea that settles in. Clay remembers, not forever, not perfectly, but long enough to hold a shape. In Mesopotamia, people shaped clay into bricks, bowls, seals, and tablets. They shaped it into the infrastructure of survival and the infrastructure of memory. Archaeology suggests that writing on clay tablets appears in the late 4th millennium BCE, and from there, records and stories begin to pile up like layers of dried river silt. You pick up a lump of clay, turn it in your hands, and imagine a scribe doing the same, only with purpose. Reed stylus, careful pressure, neat impressions, a ledger, a hymn, a myth. The difference between two sheep and two worlds can be a matter of genre, not material. It's all clay. It all dries. This is where the mainstream ground feels solid beneath your feet. Most historians agree that the Sumerians did not call themselves Sumerians in the modern sense, that city-states like Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, and Nippur rose and competed, that temples played a major economic role, and that irrigation management shaped politics as much as belief. Your eyes drift across the canal again, and you realize how naturally a society like this might imagine creation as engineering. A canal is not a miracle, but it feels like one when it keeps you alive. Now the mist starts to creep in, gently, without any jump scares. You hear the word Anunnaki in your mind, heavy with modern internet energy. In the original Mesopotamian context, Anunnaki refers to a group of deities, and their roles shift across time and texts. Some are associated with the underworld, some with divine councils, some with broad categories of the gods. One interpretation is that later readers, especially in modern fringe circles, treat the Anunnaki as a single, unified set of beings with a consistent agenda. That isn't widely accepted in academic study, but it's part of the modern myth cloud that hangs around these ancient names. And the claim we're following tonight, softly and carefully, is not that anyone proved anything. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. You walk toward the settlement. A narrow path runs beside the canal, packed earth worn smooth by feet and baskets. You pass a field where barley stands like a sleepy crowd, heads bowed. You pass a cluster of date palms that smell faintly sweet even in the dark. A frog makes a noise that suggests it has strong opinions about everything. The houses are simple, but the temple precinct rises with intention. The temple is not just a place to pray. It's a storehouse, a workplace, an administrative center. The evidence we do have points to temples coordinating labor and distributing rations, especially in the early city periods. You can almost see the lines, workers receiving grain, beer, oil. If you've ever stood in line for coffee and felt your soul leave your body, you already understand the spiritual dimension of ration distribution. Inside the temple precinct, an artisan's courtyard glows with lamplight. The smell here is different, warmer, more intimate. Wet clay, smoke, reed, and something like fermented grain. A potter turns a wheel slowly, hands steady. A brickmaker stamps uniform shapes. A scribe sits cross-legged, stylus poised, making the world into marks. You pause near the scribe, close enough to hear the faint tick of stylus on clay. The scribe's tablet is not a myth. It's a list, deliveries, measures, names. A person becomes a sign. A job becomes a sign. A ration becomes a sign. One interpretation is that this administrative mindset influenced how myths were told, because it trained people to imagine existence as a system with inputs and outputs. Grain in, labor out, water in, harvest out, order in, chaos out. Now the cinematic what-if slips in, like a shadow crossing the lamplight. What if the earliest creation story, the one you never get to read in full, sounded less like poetry and more like a workshop memo? What if it described a first model of human the way an artisan describes a cracked pot? Too brittle, too porous, doesn't hold. Start again. That's imagination, clearly framed as possibility, not conclusion. Still, it's a mood that fits the setting. Because here, nothing is purely abstract. Even gods have jobs. You step farther in, and you find a corner where figurines sit drying on a reed mat, small human shapes, pinched and smoothed, their faces simplified into calm ovals. Figurines like these exist in the archaeological record in various forms. Their precise meanings vary. Some may be devotional, some protective, some playful. Scholars continue to debate many of these objects, and it's easy to see why. A little clay person can be almost anything, depending on the story you tell around it. You pick one up gently, because in this dream you're allowed. It's cool and slightly damp. It feels startlingly alive in your hand, even though it's just mud shaped into an idea. You set it back down, and your fingertips leave a faint smudge. Here's another mainstream anchor. Mesopotamian myths often describe humans as made from clay, sometimes mixed with divine elements, sometimes created to serve the gods by doing labor. That motif appears in different forms across different texts and time periods. It's not a single story with a single version. It's a family of stories that share themes. Like relatives who all have the same nose and the same habit of arguing at dinner. Now, because you're you, and because the night invites it, you let your mind lean toward the double creation idea. How could it arise, even as an interpretation? A careful reading might suggest that when myths get copied, edited, and recontextualized over centuries, older layers can peek through, city-states rise and fall, languages shift, scribes preserve what seems important. Sometimes they compress, sometimes they expand, sometimes they harmonize competing traditions. Sometimes they let contradictions stand because contradictions can be useful, like leaving two doors unlocked in case you forget which one you came in through. You watch the scribe again. You notice how they smooth the clay surface before writing, how a mistake can be erased while the clay is wet. Smear it, re-flatten it, begin again. Clay is forgiving until it dries. In your mind, that becomes a metaphor with teeth. What if the first humans were like an early draft, smoothed away before the final version dried into permanence, not literally erased from the earth, necessarily, but erased from the official story? A change in narrative, not a cosmic crime scene. That's a more cautious explanation that could fit how myths evolve. When a society changes how it organizes labor, how it imagines kingship, how it defines proper ritual, it may also adjust how it imagines humanity's purpose. The creation story becomes a mirror that gets polished to reflect the current face. Historians still argue whether certain creation motifs are primarily theological, primarily political, or primarily social explanations wrapped in sacred language. You breathe in slowly and keep walking, letting that debate line settle like a feather on the night air. A priest passes by, robe brushing the ground. You can't see their face clearly, but you sense the weight of routine in their steps. Routine is powerful. Routine outlasts rulers. Routine outlasts even certainty. In the temple, a hymn is being recited. The words are not for you, but the cadence is. It's steady, repetitive, like waves. You stand in the shadow of a doorway and listen. You understand, in a way that doesn't require translation, that the gods here are not distant abstractions. They are administrative forces, natural forces, social forces, and personal forces. They are the names people give to the parts of life that feel bigger than any one person. Storms, rivers, fertility, justice, war, love, bureaucracy. Yes, even bureaucracy. If you've ever tried to cancel a subscription, you know bureaucracy has a supernatural aura. Now the mystery balance returns, not by abandoning history, but by hovering beside it. A fringe idea proposes that these stories aren't just metaphors or social mirrors, but memories of something literal, advanced beings, genetic tinkering, deliberate design. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because the imagery can feel strangely technical to modern eyes, mixing substances, shaping forms, assigning purpose, creating workers. It can read like a primitive lab manual if you squint, half asleep, with a dramatic soundtrack in your head. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The texts themselves are ancient literature and religious material, and mainstream scholarship treats them as such. The lab manual feeling is a modern interpretation, not a documented claim from the ancient writers. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it's important to keep it in the category of imaginative reading. Even so, you let the what-if play softly. What if the first created humans, whatever that means, were not physically different, but socially different? What if the first model is a way of talking about an earlier kind of person, a smaller community, a different labor system, a different arrangement between temple and household? Then something changes. The city grows. The temple expands. The need for coordinated labor intensifies. The myth adapts and says, in effect, humans were made for work. Not because the gods are lazy in a cartoonish sense, but because work is the glue of the system. You glance at the canal again, and it feels like the real protagonist. Without the canal, no barley. Without barley, no rations. Without rations, no labor surplus. Without labor surplus, fewer monumental buildings, fewer scribes, fewer tablets, fewer stories preserved. The canal is a line of cause and effect made visible. You kneel and scoop water into your palm. It's cool and tastes of earth. You let it spill back into the canal, and it's gone instantly, absorbed into the moving flow. You think about memory like that. A handful of it can be held. Then it returns to the stream. The artisan courtyard quiets as lamps dim. People sleep. Dogs circle and settle. Somewhere a baby fusses, and then calms. The city rests in the way only hard-working places rest. Not luxurious, just necessary. You step away from the temple precinct and wander toward the edge of the settlement, where refuse pits and broken pottery accumulate. Archaeology suggests that broken things are often our best teachers, because they survive in pieces that no one bothered to recycle. You find a shard of pottery, its surface marked with a simple pattern. Someone made that pattern with care, even knowing the pot might break someday. That's human, no matter who you think, made humans. The idea of a first erased creation feels, in this moment, less like a conspiracy and more like a human habit, revising the story of origins to suit the present. People do it with families, with nations, with personal identity. You do it with your own past when you decide what version of yourself you want to remember. Some memories get polished, some get smudged, some get flattened and rewritten. You sit on a low wall, warm from the day's sun, and you listen to the canal. It keeps moving, even when the city sleeps. That steady sound becomes your metronome. You let your eyes half close. In the softest corner of your mind, the cinematic what if returns one more time, gentle as a bedtime whisper. What if, somewhere in the oldest layers of clay, there was once a line about a first attempt? Not a monster, not a tragedy, just an attempt. And what if that line got smoothed away by a scribe who wanted the story cleaner, simpler, more useful? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You don't need the answer tonight. You just need the feeling of walking beside that canal, fingers still faintly coated in clay, while the city dreams and the stars keep their quiet watch. You drift into a busier part of the city, where the night refuses to be completely quiet. A few lamps still burn behind reed screens, and the air carries the comforting, slightly suspicious smell of beer mash, like someone is quietly winning at life. The street is narrow, packed hard by countless sandals, and the walls on either side hold on to heat as if they're reluctant to let go of the day. Somewhere a donkey snorts with the kind of attitude that says it has seen everything and is not impressed. Most historians agree that these early cities ran on organized labor and careful accounting, and you can feel that truth in the way everything is arranged, even in the dark. The city has a rhythm: storehouses near temple precincts, workshops tucked into courtyards, paths that funnel people toward gates like water toward a canal. The evidence we do have points to temples acting as powerful institutions that managed resources, rations, and work assignments. You walk past a doorway where a tablet is being dried near a low fire, and the sight makes your brain whisper. Ah, yes, humanity's greatest invention, paperwork. A guard watches you pass. He doesn't stop you, because in this dream you look like someone who belongs. You keep your shoulders relaxed, your gaze soft, the posture of a person who is not about to start trouble. A small joke bubbles up in your mind. You are basically doing ancient stealth mode, except your disguise is just confidence and a sleepy vibe. It's surprisingly effective. You come to a courtyard where several men and women sit on low benches, eating quietly. Their bowls are simple. Their conversation is low, practical, about grain measures, repairs, family obligations. Life here is not built on grand speeches. It's built on getting through the week. And yet, above them, on the temple walls and in the hymns, the divine world is painted in bold colors. That contrast matters. One interpretation is that when a society is deeply structured by institutions, the gods in its stories begin to resemble administrators, not because people lack spirituality, but because they experience the sacred through structure. A careful reading might suggest that some divine decrees in myth sound like official orders. And what if the idea of humans being made twice is really an echo of how institutions iterate, revise, and standardize the people inside them? You follow a servant carrying a basket of reeds into a side building. Inside, the air is cooler. The walls are lined with storage jars sealed with clay stoppers. Each stopper bears a seal impression. Little scenes pressed into mud. Animals, symbols, figures. Archaeology suggests that cylinder seals were used to mark ownership and authenticate transactions, and their tiny images are like miniature myth theatres. You look closely at one impression and see a figure raising an arm toward a seated deity. It's not a photo of truth, but it's a window into how people imagined relationships. The servant sets the basket down and leaves. You stay, listening. The building is a storehouse, but it feels like a temple in a different language. Order, inventory, control. The jars stand like a choir of silent witnesses. A scribe enters, and this one carries themselves like they own time itself. They kneel near a lamp and unroll a small mat, placing a tablet on it with exaggerated care. You watch them begin to write. Their stylus presses and lifts, turning sound into meaning. You cannot read the signs, but you can sense the genre. This is not a hymn. It's a record. Most historians agree that early writing in Mesopotamia grew from accounting needs, and you can almost feel the pragmatic heart of it. Yet, out of this practical system, stories survive too. That creates a fascinating blend, the sacred and the managerial sharing the same medium. Clay does not discriminate. It holds ledgers and legends with equal patience. Now your mind leans into an interpretation angle, gently labeled as interpretation. One interpretation is that if people constantly saw their lives reduced to counts and categories, they might start imagining themselves as created for a function, not just born, but assigned, not just alive, but slotted. That is not a cynical take. It's an anthropological mood. When you are given rations because you are a worker, the story of why humans exist might start to sound like, humans exist to work. You step deeper into the storehouse and find a small side room where tools hang on pegs, bronze awls, wooden mallets, polished stones, reed bundles, a workroom. The lamplight flickers and turns every tool into a shadow puppet. Your fingers hover over a wooden mold used for shaping something repetitive. Maybe bricks, maybe small objects. This is where the created twice idea can be explored without pretending it's documented fact. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Documented ground. Mesopotamian creation myths often describe humanity as made to relieve the gods of labor. That theme appears in several traditions, though details differ by text and period, interpreted angle. Those myths could reflect social reality, where leaders needed a moral story that made labor feel cosmic rather than merely economic. Imagined what if? You picture a divine workshop where a supervisor god frowns at a first batch of workers and says, "Not quite. Try again." In the corner, you notice a scrap of clay that has been flattened and reworked. It looks like a practice tablet, the kind a student might use. The surface is smudged with failed signs and corrected impressions. You pick it up and run your thumb along the marks. It's strangely soothing, like touching an ancient notebook full of crossed-out homework. What if the double creation is like that? A draft, then a revision. Not necessarily because the first humans were annihilated, but because the story itself was revised to fit a new worldview. This is suggestive, not conclusive. And the fun is in keeping the solid ground separate from the mist. A quiet voice speaks behind you. An older scribe, maybe a teacher, steps into the lamp glow. Their face is lined, their eyes alert. They look at the practice tablet in your hand and smile faintly, as if you've discovered a private joke. They gesture for you to follow. You walk with them through a corridor where the walls are plastered smooth. You pass niches holding small offerings, bits of bread, dates, a tiny cup. The corridor opens into a room where several young apprentices sit with tablets on their laps. Their hands are dusty with clay. Their shoulders are tense with effort. You recognize the universal posture of students, equal parts hope and dread. The teacher speaks softly, and the apprentices begin repeating signs. The lesson is about accuracy. Press here, angle there, leave space, do not rush. The mood is calm, but you can feel the stakes. A mistake in a ledger can ripple through rations and labor assignments. A mistake in a ritual text can ripple through belief. Historians still argue whether the primary driver of early state power was temple control, royal control, or a shifting balance between the two. The debate line lands in the room like chalk dust, and you realize why it matters to the story tonight. If power shifts between temple and palace, stories shift too. If one group wants to emphasize divine order and human service, it highlights one set of myths. If another group wants to emphasize kingship and conquest, it highlights another. The creation story can become a political tool without losing its sacred aura. Humans can be described as workers, then described as subjects, then described as something else, depending on who is doing the describing. The teacher lifts a small cylinder seal and rolls it across a damp patch of clay, leaving a crisp image. The apprentices lean in, fascinated. The image shows a figure presenting something to a seated deity. The teacher taps the impression, then taps a blank space beside it, as if saying, meaning is assigned, identity is stamped. A popular rumor claims that ancient seals and myths hide literal technical diagrams, like secret blueprints disguised as art. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it's a perfect example of how modern minds project modern ideas onto ancient media. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes an imaginative exercise. What would a blueprint look like to a person whose world is clay and reads? You imagine the apprentices not just learning signs, but learning how to make reality legible. Writing is a technology of control, but also a technology of continuity. When you can record who owes what, you can build systems larger than any one memory. That's mainstream history, and it's already astonishing without needing aliens. Still, the mystery theory balance asks for a gentle drift into possibility. What if the first humans weren't a separate species at all, but a first attempt at social engineering, a system tried one way, then revised? The story might encode that as creation number 1, then creation number 2. The erasure might be the disappearance of older social forms, older village life, older freedoms, flattened like wet clay under the thumb of a growing institution. You watch an apprentice's tablet. Their signs are uneven, but improving. They wipe a mistake with a wet cloth and try again. Erasure is part of learning. Erasure is not always violent. Sometimes it's just editing. The teacher leads you out again, away from the classroom, into the open air. The night has deepened. The stars look sharper. A breeze moves through and brings the scent of river water and distant fires. In a nearby courtyard, men are loading baskets onto a sled. The baskets clink softly, perhaps filled with jars or tools. A supervisor counts under his breath, then nods. Labor in motion. Organized. Most historians agree that rulers and temple authorities used labor, corvée, rations, and obligations to build and maintain large projects. One interpretation is that myths about being created for work helped normalize that obligation. And what if the first creation story was too generous, too human-centered, and later editors tightened it into something more obedient? To be clear, this is debated, and it's not something we can confirm from the surviving evidence alone. But it's a calm, plausible way to explore the idea without turning it into a single hidden truth. You pass a small shrine where an oil lamp burns low. Someone has left a tiny figurine, crude but earnest. The flame trembles and makes the figurine's shadow dance on the wall. It looks like a person walking, then melting, then walking again. Your sleepy mind finds that strangely poetic. You slow your pace. The city's organized heart keeps beating. But you're letting your attention soften, letting the sounds blur into a lullaby. Somewhere, a worker laughs quietly, the kind of laugh that says tomorrow is heavy, but tonight is still yours. Somewhere, a reed flute plays a simple line and then stops, like a thought that decides it doesn't need to finish. You stand at the edge of a workyard and look at the tools again, hanging neatly, ready for morning. You imagine a divine workshop in the same arrangement, tools lined up, plans drafted, revisions made, not as fact, but as a bedtime image. A god presses clay, frowns, smooths, presses again. The second shape stands a little straighter, breathes a little quieter, fits the system a little better. And you, listening in your own room, feel your shoulders loosen as the ancient city keeps its calm order around you, as if the night itself is a ledger being balanced, line by line, until sleep finally signs its name at the bottom. You step into a place where stories go to break, not in a dramatic thunder and lightning way, but in the quiet, practical way things break in real life. A corner of the city where discarded clay and shattered pots collect, where cracked tablets get tossed aside once the important parts have been copied, where the ground is layered with yesterday's mistakes. The air smells dry here, dusty and warm, with faint traces of ash and old grain. The moonlight turns every shard into a pale smile. Archaeology suggests that a huge amount of what we know comes from what was thrown away or buried by accident. Fires collapse roofs, walls fall, rooms get sealed, libraries become time capsules, and because clay tablets can survive when papyrus and parchment would rot away, the clay ends up acting like an unplanned memory bank. You crouch and sift through fragments. Some are pottery, some are bits of brick, some are tablets, broken into uneven chunks, their edges jagged like torn paper. You turn one piece in your hand and catch a few wedge marks. Not enough to read, not enough to be sure of anything, just enough to feel the presence of intention. The evidence we do have points to scribes copying and recopying texts over centuries, and that process produces both preservation and loss. A tablet can crack, a line can smear, a missing corner can swallow a name. A worm can burrow through a shelf of clay like it's doing its own chaotic editing project. Your sleepy brain thinks, wow, ancient worms really said, I will become a critic. Not their best review. Honestly, you walk deeper into the debris field, and the city's ordered hush gives way to a different kind of silence, the kind that feels like a half-finished sentence. Here, the erased first humans idea starts to look less like a clean plot twist and more like a natural consequence of fragmentary evidence. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Documented anchor. Many Mesopotamian myths survive in incomplete form, sometimes in multiple versions, and scholars compare fragments to reconstruct likely readings. Interpreted angle. When a text has gaps, people may wonder what kinds of ideas used to occupy those missing spaces, including older versions of creation stories. Imagined what if. You picture a line about a first attempt at humanity sitting right where the tablet is broken, like a secret that only exists because it is missing. You stand and follow a narrow path between low mounds. Your sandals crunch softly on grit. A stray cat watches you from a broken wall, eyes half-lidded, as if it's deciding whether you are worth the emotional investment. It blinks slowly, a universal sign for, I tolerate you. You feel honored. A small structure stands nearby, half collapsed. Inside, you see shelves built into the wall, and on the floor, clusters of tablet fragments. This could be a storage room, a scribal space, or simply a place where broken things were swept and left. You step carefully, because you do not want to become the person who trips and accidentally creates a brand new fragment. Imagine explaining that. Yes, hello, I have contributed to the ruin. Not your best legacy. You pick up another fragment. This one has more writing. A few signs repeat, suggesting a formula. It might be a hymn. It might be a myth. It might be a legal text, which is basically a myth about people behaving. And everyone knows that's the most fictional genre of all. You smile to yourself, then soften your face again into calm. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian literature was not static. Stories were performed, adapted, and reshaped by scribes. Different city traditions emphasized different gods. Political shifts influenced which myths got copied and how they were framed. Even if a story begins in one city, it can be reinterpreted elsewhere, picking up new meanings like dust on sandals. One interpretation is that the idea of two creations could arise when multiple traditions about human origins overlap. Imagine two lines of storytelling running side by side. One says humans are made from clay as a general sacred motif. Another says humans are made in a specific moment to solve a specific divine problem. When scribes preserve both, or blend them, you get a layered narrative that can feel like more than one creation. Now the mist comes in gently. What if the layering is not just two traditions, but two versions of the human purpose? A first version that imagines humanity as partners with the divine, caretakers in a shared world. A second version that imagines humanity as labourers, created to shoulder burdens. That is cinematic imagination, clearly marked as possibility, not certainty. You wander through the room, and your attention catches on something small and strange. A fragment with a tiny doodle in the margin, a little animal shape, maybe a goat, maybe a dog, maybe a creature that only exists in the artist's boredom. Quirky doodles appear in many manuscript traditions across human history. It's comforting. Even in the ancient world, someone sat in class and said, "I'm going to draw a weird little guy right here." Humanity never changes. It just gets different hats. You set the fragment back down and let your gaze drift to the shelves. Some tablets are whole, some cracked, some missing corners. This is where your mind can play with the concept of erasure in two very different ways. First, a mainstream, grounded way. Erasure as accident. A corner breaks off. A shelf collapses. A flood soaks a room and washes away unbaked clay. A fire bakes some tablets hard and destroys others. Time is selective, and it is not polite about it. Second, an interpreted way. Erasure as editorial choice. Scribes decide what is worth copying. Priests decide what is worth reciting. Kings decide what is worth funding. Anything that does not serve the present can fade, not because it was forbidden in some dramatic sense, but because it was not prioritized. And then, the imagined what if. A deliberate smoothing, the way you smooth clay when you want to start over. A line about a first human creation, perhaps messy or inconvenient, perhaps too wild or too compassionate, gets quietly left behind in the copy process. Not burned, not banned, just not recopied. A story dies the way a rumour dies when nobody repeats it. Historians still argue whether the differences between myth versions reflect deliberate political revision, normal scribal variation, or the natural evolution of oral storytelling. You breathe in, and the debate line settles into you like a slow exhale. Now you step toward a larger building nearby, one with thicker walls and a doorway that still stands. Inside, the air is cooler, and the smell changes. Less dust, more old clay. You see a work table with a shallow bowl of water and a pile of reeds. A scribal room. The floor is scattered with clay crumbs, the leftovers of smoothing and reshaping. You touch the table. It's worn smooth where elbows rested. You can almost feel the presence of people who sat here, repeating signs until their hands learned the language. Writing in this place is not just expression. It is training, discipline, and tradition. It is also vulnerability, because once something is written, it can be broken, lost, misunderstood, or reinterpreted. A careful reading might suggest that some creation language is symbolic, reflecting agricultural life and craft, mixing clay, shaping forms, breathing life. Those images fit a world where artisans and farmers shape their environment daily. A fringe idea proposes that the same language should be read literally as a record of advanced biological engineering. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin, but it persists because the metaphors are vivid, and modern minds love to map modern concepts onto ancient words. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The metaphor can feel technical, but feels technical is not the same as is technical. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it belongs in the category of imaginative interpretation. You move to a shelf and find a tablet that is whole enough to show its shape, rectangular, hand-sized, the surface filled with neat lines. It is drying. The clay is firm, but not fully hard. You realize something quietly important. In this state, a tablet is still editable. A stylus can press in new wedges. A wet cloth can blur a mistake. A palm can smooth a section back to blank. In other words, erasure does not require drama. Erasure can be a fingertip. You imagine a student making an error in a myth text, the teacher frowning, the student rubbing out a line. Was the erased line just a misspelling? Or could it have been something more interesting? You cannot know. And that not knowing is where mystery likes to curl up and purr. You step outside again. The night is deeper now, and the city feels like it is holding its breath. You walk toward a mound where old building layers have accumulated. These mounds form over centuries as structures collapse and new ones are built on top. The ground becomes a stacked archive of living. Archaeology suggests that these layers can preserve sequences of occupation. Each stratum like a chapter written in soil. One interpretation is that myths operate like these mounds. New stories build on old ones. Old themes remain underneath, sometimes visible at the edges, sometimes completely buried. So when someone says humans were created twice, it might be a way of sensing layers, a newer creation story sitting on top of an older one. You climb the mound slowly. At the top, you can see the dark shapes of rooftops and courtyards. A few lamps glow. A dog moves like a shadow. The river is a darker ribbon beyond the walls. You sit and let the breeze cool your face. You think about how a first humanity could be erased without anyone ever noticing, simply because nobody alive remembers it. Memory is social. If a community stops telling a story, it stops being real in the communal sense, even if it once mattered deeply. Now, you let the cinematic imagination take a gentle step forward. What if the first human creation, in the mythic sense, represented a kind of person who did not fit the developing city? Maybe too independent. Maybe too close to the old village rhythms. Maybe too untidy for the temple's ledgers. So the story adjusts. The first version fades. The second version becomes official. Humans are described in a way that matches the city's needs. You smile, because your mind adds a sleepy joke. Ancient editors basically said, "We're going to rebrand humanity." And honestly, modern marketing departments would salute them. You stand and walk down the mound. Your feet find the packed earth easily. The city is calm, and your thoughts are calm. You are not chasing certainty tonight. You're following the feeling of broken tablets and missing corners, of stories that survive not as complete statues, but as scattered pieces. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You pass a small courtyard where a lamp has burned low, leaving a thin trail of smoke. The smoke curls upward and dissolves. It looks like a thought fading as you drift toward sleep. You listen to the quiet, and you imagine the clay beneath the city holding countless impressions, some clear, some smudged, some erased, and some waiting to be imagined gently, without ever being forced into a single, final answer. You find yourself walking along a stretch of riverbank that feels wider, quieter, and more serious, the way a room feels when someone has just mentioned a topic nobody wants to joke about. The reeds are taller here. The water moves with a steady confidence, as if it has been practicing for thousands of years. The air smells of wet earth and faint minerals, and the night wind carries a coolness that makes your skin relax. Most historians agree that flood traditions are widespread in Mesopotamia and beyond, appearing in multiple stories that share family resemblances. The evidence we do have points to real experiences with flooding in river societies, where seasonal changes and unpredictable surges could reshape land and lives. This is the solid ground. In a world built on irrigation and river control, water is both salvation and threat. And people remember that in their myths, you walk past low, muddy marks on the bank where the river has climbed before. You can read the story in the landscape without needing words. The river rises, people scramble, structures weaken, fields drown. Then, eventually, the water retreats, leaving behind silt, debris, and a new arrangement of what normal looks like. A careful reading might suggest that flood myths do more than describe water. They describe resets. They describe social and moral recalibration. They describe the terrifying moment when the system breaks and then restarts. And that's where the idea of a first humanity being erased can slip in as interpretation. Not because we can confirm it from one clean line of text, but because the logic of the myth invites the question. What happens to the old version of the world when the world is rebooted? You reach a place where a small boat is tied to a stake, rocking softly. It's made of reeds bundled tight, sealed with bitumen. It smells like tar and river plants. Your hand rests on the rough surface, and you feel how light it is, how it could ride high on water when the river turns dangerous. The craft feels like a solution, invented by people who learned the river's moods the hard way. Now the story mood deepens. You let the flood theme rise around you, not in a loud, scary way, but in a slow, dreamlike way, like fog moving across a field. In Mesopotamian literature, one well-known flood narrative involves a wise man, warned of a coming disaster, who builds a vessel, preserves life, and survives a divine decision to wipe the slate clean. Different versions exist, with different names and details across time. The mainstream point is simple. Flood stories were meaningful and persistent, and they were told and retold because they spoke to real anxieties and real experiences. One interpretation is that the flood narrative encodes a kind of poor administrative frustration. People multiply, noise increases, social pressure builds, and the divine realm responds like an overwhelmed landlord hearing a party next door at 3 a.m. Not exactly the noble cosmic mystery you expect, but honestly, very relatable. Your sleepy joke lands gently. Even the gods might have wanted just one quiet night with a fan humming and no notifications. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the noise element in some flood stories could symbolize more than literal sound. It could symbolize disorder, overpopulation, strain on resources, or the breakdown of ritual boundaries. The story becomes a mythic way of discussing a crisis that feels too big for normal language. And here comes the what if, clearly labelled as imagination. What if the first created humans were not erased by an edit on a tablet, but by a reset in the world itself, the kind of reset a flood can represent? In that imagined frame, the first version of humanity is washed away, and what comes after is a second creation, a second arrangement, a second chance. That is cinematic and calm, not a claim of confirmed fact. You pull the boat rope gently, and the vessel bumps the bank with a soft thud. The sound is like punctuation. You step into the boat and sit, letting it rock you. The river's motion is slow and hypnotic, and your breathing follows it without effort. Archaeology suggests that communities adapted to floods with architecture, levees, canal management, and seasonal planning. People were not helpless victims in a river world. They engineered solutions. That mainstream truth matters because it reminds you that myth is not replacing reality. Myth is decorating reality with meaning. Now, the idea of a double creation gains a new flavour, not workshop revision, but survival revision. A society that experiences catastrophic disruption may later describe itself as newly made, newly ordered. The second humanity might be a metaphor for the post-crisis world, where new rules are established, boundaries are reinforced, and memory is reorganized. Historians still argue whether the flood traditions preserve memories of specific historical flood events, or whether they are primarily literary and symbolic constructions shaped by shared cultural themes. The debate line floats over the water and settles into the night. You push off from the bank with a pole, and the boat drifts into the darker centre of the river. Stars reflect in the water, breaking into fragments whenever ripples pass. The reflection looks like a shattered tablet of light. You let that image sit with you because it feels perfect for this theme. The past exists as reflection and fragment, never fully still. In the distance, you see a low-lying area where the river has spread into marsh. The water there is calmer, but it hides things. Reeds thicken, fish flicker. The marsh smells rich, alive, slightly funky. It's the kind of smell that tells you nature is busy doing chemistry. You drift toward the marsh, and the air grows cooler. A bird calls once, then settles. Everything is quiet enough that you can hear your own thoughts, which, if we're being honest, is sometimes the loudest flood of all. Now you think about the erasure part again, but with a more careful, grounded lens. Erasure can happen through catastrophe. If a settlement is destroyed, its records can be lost. If a scribal tradition ends, certain texts stop being copied. If a language shifts, older stories can become harder to transmit. None of that requires a dramatic villain. It's the normal fragility of human continuity. One interpretation is that flood myths might have been used to explain why there are gaps in memory, why certain names vanish, why certain practices feel ancient, but undocumented. A story about the gods wiping away humanity becomes a cosmic explanation for the terrifying fact that history can simply disappear. A fringe idea proposes that the flood is not just symbolic or local, but global, and tied to advanced technology or cosmic warfare. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence for it is not strong in mainstream research. Still, it exists as a modern myth layer, often fueled by the way ancient texts describe divine decisions and extraordinary events with vivid intensity. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic frame, a world reset not by rain, but by something stranger. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The ancient texts use mythic language, and mythic language can sound like anything if you want it to. That's why we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The boat slides into the marsh, and the water becomes shallower. The reeds brush the sides with a soft whispering sound. It's oddly soothing, like the world is shushing you gently. You reach out and touch a reed, feeling its smooth surface. It bends and returns. Patient. You notice small clay lumps on a muddy patch, shaped by hand. Someone has been repairing something, sealing a leak, patching a vessel, reinforcing a joint. Clay again, always clay. In this world, clay is the universal fix. It's the duct tape of antiquity, except more elegant and less likely to end up stuck to your elbow hair. You pick up a lump and roll it between your fingers. It warms slightly. It holds shape. You think about the story of humans as clay creations, and you feel the metaphor in your skin. If humans are clay, then floods can dissolve them. But if humans are clay, then they can also be reshaped. That's a gentle philosophical turn, but it fits the bedtime tone. You're not trying to solve an academic puzzle tonight. You're letting your mind float. The river doesn't ask you for conclusions. It just moves. You steer the boat toward a slightly raised patch of land, a small island of firm ground in the marsh. You step out, shoes sinking slightly, and you climb to a spot where you can sit. The marsh stretches around you like a dark blanket. The stars above look steady, indifferent, and comforting. Now, a new development enters the story. The idea of rule after a reset. Flood stories often include new boundaries, new promises, new structures meant to prevent chaos from returning. That detail is important because it suggests a second version of humanity might be defined by constraints. A first world is free and noisy. A second world is measured and quieter. Again, that is interpretation, not confirmed fact. But it is a reasonable reading of how reset myths function. You imagine survivors returning to mud-caked land, rebuilding, redigging canals, replanting barley. They are the same species, the same kind of people, but they are not the same society. They have learned something. They have lost something. They carry trauma in the way they stack bricks, in the way they store grain, in the way they tell stories to children at night. What if the first humans were erased in the sense that their carefree world ended? What if the second humans are the cautious rebuilders, shaped by catastrophe into a new pattern? That's not proof. It's a bedtime interpretation, a way of seeing myth as a lens on human experience. You sit and listen to the marsh. Tiny ripples move. Insects hum. The world is alive in small, repetitive sounds. You feel your eyelids grow heavier, and you let them. In the quiet, you return to the safety rule. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. The evidence we do have points to flood stories as powerful cultural narratives in a river world. The rest is interpretation and gentle imagination, kept separate, like 2 jars on a shelf labeled clearly, so you don't accidentally drink the wrong one at midnight. You breathe slowly, and the river keeps its steady motion, as if it is rocking the whole landscape toward sleep. You walk into a city that feels like it's wearing a crown. The streets are wider, the walls taller, and the temple complex rises like a carefully designed mountain of brick. Even at night, the place hums with confidence. Lamps burn in higher windows. Guards stand straighter. The air smells of baked clay and incense, with a faint metallic edge that suggests workshops never fully sleep. If the earlier towns felt like living organisms, this one feels like an empire, learning to speak in slogans. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian myths were often shaped by political centers, and that as power moved, stories moved with it. The evidence we do have points to Babylon becoming a major cultural force in the early 2nd millennium BCE, and one of the most famous mythic texts associated with Babylonian identity is a creation epic that tells of cosmic conflict, order, and the establishment of authority. That is solid ground. Empires like to explain why they deserve to be in charge, and they often do it with stories that sound like the universe itself voted for them. You pass a wall relief, carved shallowly, showing figures in procession. The carvings are not meant to be a documentary photo. They are meant to be a mood, a message, a reminder. The city is telling you what it wants you to believe. A careful reading might suggest that when a myth emphasizes one god rising above others, it can mirror a political hierarchy. Divine order reflects human order, or human order borrows the divine as a costume. One interpretation is that these creation stories are not just about the beginnings of the world, but about the beginnings of a political worldview that says, this is how things should be arranged. You step into a courtyard where scribes are gathered, their tablets stacked like bricks of information. Their voices are low, their hands are precise. They are copying a text that matters, a text with authority. The lines are practiced, and the room feels like a printing press before printing presses existed. Clay is the medium, but ideology is the product. Now you let the mystery angle slip in, gently and safely. What if the claim that humans were created twice is less about biology and more about propaganda? Not propaganda in a modern insult sense, but in the neutral sense of narrative shaping. A first model of humanity exists in older, regional myths. Then an empire rises and says, we need a new cosmic story, one that justifies our structure. The second model of humanity is not a new species, but a new role assignment. You walk closer to the scribes. One of them pauses and rubs their wrist, the ancient equivalent of complaining about carpal tunnel. You want to pat them on the shoulder and say, you are literally shaping history. But that might be too intense, so you keep it to yourself. Also, you're trying to be sleep-friendly, not emotionally overwhelming. The scribe resumes, and you catch repeated phrases, the language of decree, of fate, of establishing boundaries. Archaeology suggests that written texts could carry ritual authority and cultural prestige, and you can feel that weight here. The tablet is not just a story, it is a statement. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian creation epics often involve conflict among divine beings, followed by the establishment of cosmic order. In some traditions, humanity is created in connection with that order, often to serve the gods by maintaining temples, offerings, and the regular rhythms of worship. This is the mainstream anchor. People explained their social obligations in cosmic terms. Now, the interpretation angle. One interpretation is that the twice-created idea could emerge when a myth about making the world is followed by a myth about organizing it. In other words, creation happens in two stages. First, raw existence. Second, structured existence. If you're a person living under an expanding empire, that second stage can feel like a brand new creation, because suddenly your life has more rules, more taxes, more official languages, and more people telling you where to stand. Your sleepy joke arrives. Congrats, you have been created again, and your new purpose is filling out forms. You pass by a temple workshop where artisans are making ceremonial objects. A metalworker taps softly, shaping a thin sheet with controlled strikes. The sound is delicate, like rain on a window. In another corner, a priest mixes incense ingredients, grinding them into powder. The scent rises, sweet and sharp. Everything is curated. Everything is meant to reinforce a sense of sacred order. And now the cinematic what if, clearly labeled as imagination. What if the story of a first humanity being erased is really the story of an older religious system being replaced? The people are still there, still breathing, still farming and laughing and falling in love. But the official narrative changes. The gods in charge shift. The creation story gets rewritten to center the new authority. The first version of human origins becomes unofficial, then forgotten, then treated as a rumor. Historians still argue whether these mythic changes were primarily driven by political conquest, gradual cultural blending, or internal theological development. You let the debate line settle, and you keep walking. In a quiet corner of the temple complex, you find a room where older tablets are stored. The air is dry, and the shelves are crowded. Some tablets are labeled with small tags. Others are stacked by size. The room feels like a library that breathes dust instead of air. You run your fingers along the edge of one tablet and feel the fine grit. This one speaks in a different voice. The signs are slightly different, the phrasing less polished. It feels older, or at least copied from something older. You cannot read it, but you can sense the texture of time in it. One interpretation is that scribes sometimes preserved older texts, even when the official ideology shifted, because scribes valued tradition and learning. That means older creation ideas could remain in the background. Like older songs, people still hum when nobody is listening. But over time, the official version becomes louder. The older one becomes faint. Not destroyed, just outcompeted. A fringe idea proposes that when myths talk about gods battling and rearranging the cosmos, they are describing literal catastrophic events, perhaps even advanced weapons, and that humanity needed to be remade to survive a changed environment. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin, still, as a bedtime what if. It offers a cinematic frame, a world altered so dramatically that the second creation is the adaptation that follows. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Mythic language is not technical reporting, and it can map onto many interpretations. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You leave the library room and step into an open courtyard where a shallow pool reflects the stars. The surface is still, and the reflection makes the sky look like it has been poured into the earth. A priest passes, murmuring a line of ritual speech, and the sound is soft, like a lullaby that learned how to be official. Now you notice something that feels like a new development. The city is not just telling a creation story, it is performing it. The temple rituals, the offerings, the processions, the hymns, the distribution of food, all of it reenacts the idea that order must be maintained daily. If humanity's purpose is to uphold cosmic order, then every morning is a miniature second creation. The world exists, but it must be remade through ritual attention. That interpretation can make the created twice idea feel less like a single event and more like a pattern. First, humans exist. Second, humans are assigned into the system of maintenance. The first is breath. The second is duty. You watch workers carrying baskets of bread toward a storage room. Their steps are steady. Their faces are tired, but calm. They move as if they have done this 1,000 times. The system holds because people hold it. Most historians agree that the relationship between temples, kingship, and labor-shaped daily life in Mesopotamian cities. The evidence we do have points to complex administrative systems, and those systems needed a story that made them feel inevitable. Creation myths can serve that role, offering a cosmic reason for why someone should wake up early and haul barley. Not glamorous, but effective. You sit on a low bench near the pool and listen to the night. In the distance, a drum taps slowly, marking time. It is not a war drum. It's a ritual beat, steady and measured. It feels like the city's heartbeat, reminding everyone that order is not just desired. It is rehearsed. Now, you let yourself imagine a scene. Softly, a divine council meets. They decide the world needs stability. They create humans. Not once, but in 2 passes. First pass, beings who can live. Second pass, beings who can maintain. The erasure is not slaughter, but the quiet removal of traits that don't fit the system. Too wild, too free, too noisy. The second version is gentler, more compliant, more able to carry routines without questioning every single line. To be clear, this is debated, and belongs to the realm of interpretation and imagination, not documented certainty. Yet, it fits the vibe of a city that feels like it is wearing a crown. A city that believes order is the highest virtue. You stand again and walk toward the outer streets. A vendor is still awake, stirring a pot. The smell is savory, comforting. You realize that even in a myth-shaped empire, people still want warm food at night. Some truths are universal. Hunger does not care about theology. You buy a small bowl in the dream, taste something like lentils and herbs, and feel your body relax. The warmth settles in your stomach like a promise. As you walk, the city's grand walls fade into the dark. The stars remain. The night remains. And the idea lingers in a calm, non-absolute way. Perhaps the twice-created notion is a reflection of layered storytelling in a world where power shifts. Myths are curated, and humanity is repeatedly redefined by whoever holds the stylus. You wander into a place where the air feels thinner, like the city is giving way to open land, and open land is giving way to pure story. The ground is rougher under your feet, scattered with small stones and dry grass. The night sky stretches wider here, and the stars look less like decoration and more like surveillance. Not scary surveillance, just the quiet kind, like when your cat watches you make a snack and judges every choice. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian motifs traveled far beyond Mesopotamia through trade, conquest, migration, and the slow leaking of ideas from one language into another. Stories mingle, names shift, and characters put on new masks. The evidence we do have points to later cultures reworking older themes, sometimes preserving echoes of earlier gods, earlier floods, earlier cosmic battles, while framing them in new moral or theological contexts. You walk along a dirt track toward a cluster of tents. The people here speak in a different cadence, and their clothes are cut differently. Their cooking fires smell of sheep fat and wild herbs. You are still in the ancient world, but you're in a crossroads space where stories are traded like goods. A man by the fire tells a tale with his hands. His gestures are dramatic, but his voice stays low, because it's night and everyone wants to sleep eventually. He speaks of beings that come from above, beings that cross boundaries. He speaks of unions that should not happen, and of consequences that ripple through generations. Now, we keep them a solid ground separate from the mist. Documented anchor. There are later texts, especially in the wider Near Eastern and Mediterranean tradition. That includes stories or heavenly beings interacting with humans, sometimes framed as transgressive or forbidden. Interpreted angle. Scholars often see these as moral narratives, metaphors for boundary breaking, power abuse, or cultural anxiety about outsiders. Imagined what if. You picture the first humans as a version that crossed a line, forcing the story to hit a reset button and begin again. A popular rumor claims that these later Watcher-type stories are direct records of ancient extraterrestrials. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for that literal reading is thin. But it persists because it offers a neat, cinematic explanation. And neat explanations are like warm blankets for the brain. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a bedtime lens, not proof, but atmosphere. You sit near the fire. The warmth is immediate, and the smoke curls up into the night like a prayer that forgot the words. Someone passes you a piece of flatbread. You take it and chew slowly, tasting char, salt, and a faint sweetness. A child nearby has fallen asleep mid-story, mouth slightly open, head tipped back like they are personally auditioning to be the mascot for bedtime. The storyteller continues, and you notice something subtle. The tale is not just about beings from above. It's about rules. About what is allowed and what is forbidden, about mixing categories that are meant to stay separate. That is a universal myth pattern, and it shows up in many cultures. It's a way of talking about danger without listing dangers. One interpretation is that the twice-created concept could be tied to a taboo narrative. First creation produces humans in a stable arrangement. Then something happens that breaks the boundaries. The world becomes unstable. The story responds by imagining a correction, a second creation, a second attempt with stricter limits. Historians still argue whether these boundary-crossing myths reflect historical social conflicts, symbolic theological lessons, or a blend of multiple older traditions. The debate line falls softly into the firelight, and the flames keep moving, unbothered. You stand and walk away from the tents toward a low ridge. The wind is stronger up here, and it carries the scent of dry earth and distant water. Below, you can see faint lights from settlements, and beyond them, darkness that feels like unclaimed space. Now you meet the mystery element head on, but gently. A fringe idea proposes that there were off-script events in the ancient past, moments when beings described as divine interacted with humans in ways that were later edited into moral lessons. In this framing, the first humans are erased not by floodwater or paperwork, but by a decision to close the system, to lock the gate, to prevent further mixing. Let me rephrase that more carefully. This is debated, and it's not widely accepted. It's a speculative reading that treats myth as coded history. That approach can be fascinating as imagination, but it is not the same as documented evidence. You pause on the ridge and look up at the stars again. The sky feels like a dome. You can see why ancient people imagined layers above, realms stacked like floors. The stars are steady points that seem to hold the night in place. A new development enters your thoughts. The role of names. When stories travel, names change. A god in one tradition becomes an angel in another. A divine council becomes a heavenly host. A craft myth becomes a moral myth. That transformation can create the illusion of hidden continuity. One interpretation is that what sounds like a brand new story might be an older story in disguise. You walk toward a small stone marker on the ridge. Maybe a boundary sign. Maybe a shrine. Someone has placed a simple offering there. A few beads, a pinch of grain. The offering is humble, and it makes you think of human fear and hope as practical tools. When you cannot control the sky, you negotiate with it. You sit beside the marker. The stone is cool. You rest your palm on it and feel its rough texture. Now you imagine, softly, a council meeting, not in a shiny sci-fi way, but in a mythic way. The beings in the story discuss the problem. Humans aren't behaving as intended. They are forming alliances, learning secrets, crossing boundaries. The story might frame this as moral failure. Another interpretation is that it reflects elite anxiety about knowledge spreading too widely. When too many people know too much, power becomes harder to hold. And what if that anxiety becomes written into the myth as an erased first version? The first humans, in this imagined mood, are too curious, too bold, too interested in the wrong questions. The second humans are designed to be more manageable, more compliant, more forgetful of certain knowledge. To be clear, that cinematic imagination, it is not a confirmed historical event. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You look down from the ridge and watch a caravan moving slowly in the distance, a line of shapes that could be camels or donkeys. Their bells tinkle faintly, a sound that feels like tiny stars falling. Trade routes connect worlds. Ideas travel with spices and wool and metal. Myths ride along too, changing with each telling. Most historians agree that cultural exchange in the ancient Near East was intense, and that motifs could be borrowed, adapted, and reinterpreted across languages and religions. That mainstream truth makes the Watcher-style rumors understandable. People inherit older symbols and make them speak to new concerns. You walk back toward the tents, and you notice a group of elders sitting apart, speaking quietly. Their faces are serious. You catch a few words that feel like warnings. Do not go there. Do not speak that name. Do not cross that river at night. Their tone is not hysterical. It's protective. Boundaries again. One interpretation is that boundary myths encode community survival strategies. Don't mingle with hostile groups. Don't break social taboos that keep peace. Don't challenge the gods, meaning don't challenge the moral order that holds society together. The first humans erased could be a mythic example. See what happens when you cross the line. A fringe idea proposes that the line was literal, like a restricted zone, a forbidden site, a place where something dangerous was stored or something powerful happened. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence is thin. But it makes a vivid bedtime picture, a hidden workshop, a sealed chamber, a decision made to start over with a safer design. You step back into the firelight and feel warmth on your face. The storyteller has changed topics now, talking about a hero who refuses to surrender, about a king who seeks immortality, about the limits of human life. The transition feels natural, because all these myths orbit the same center: what humans are for, and what humans are allowed to become. You realize that the created twice idea has another possible shape. Perhaps the first creation is the raw human, driven by hunger, curiosity, pride. The second creation is the civilized human, shaped by law, ritual, and moral constraints. In that reading, the erasure is the erasure of wildness, the trimming of instincts, the discipline that turns a person into a citizen. That is an interpretation, and it can sit comfortably beside the more literal-sounding theories without pretending to replace them. Historians still argue whether ancient myths should be read primarily as reflections of real social structures, as psychological archetypes, or as literary art with its own internal logic. You let that line settle again, because debates are part of the calm truth of history. Certainty as rare. Layers are common. The fire crackles. Someone yawns. The child stirs and then relaxes. The night air cools, and the warmth of the flames becomes more precious. You feel your own eyelids growing heavier, and you allow the stories to blur into a gentle haze. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Tonight. The Watcher rumor is mist. The cultural exchange is solid ground. The boundary theme is a bridge between them. You lean back, watching sparks rise and vanish. For a moment, each spark looks like a tiny created thing, born, glowing, and erased, not by malice, but by the simple rule of night air. You step into a room that smells like metal, herbs, and damp stone. It is not a grand temple chamber. It is a tucked-away workshop where practical people do quiet, careful work. The doorway is low. The light is dim, coming from a single oil lamp that makes everything feel intimate and secret without being scary. On a table, bowls are arranged neatly. In one bowl, crushed minerals glitter faintly. In another, oily resin clings to the sides. A third holds something dark and thick, like bitumen or a medicinal paste. The air has that unmistakable vibe of someone is mixing something that is probably important, which is also the vibe of every modern kitchen at 1A. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamians practiced sophisticated crafts, metallurgy, textile production, brewing, medicine, and complex building techniques. The evidence we do have points to specialized knowledge being held and transmitted through apprenticeships and temple or palace-sponsored workshops. This is solid ground. People knew how to transform raw materials into tools, remedies, and ritual objects. You pick up a small stone pestle and feel its weight. It fits your hand as if it was shaped for your palm. You gently press it into a bowl of crushed herb and rotate. The scent rises immediately, sharp and green, and your eyes half close with the pleasure of it. The act of grinding is slow, repetitive, and calming. You understand why this kind of work could feel sacred. It is transformation you can smell. Now the interpretation angle arrives in a careful, labeled way. One interpretation is that when ancient texts speak of mixing substances to create life, they could be drawing on the everyday reality of craft and medicine. In a world where you can brew beer from grain, dye cloth with plants, seal boats with bitumen, and treat wounds with poultices, the idea of shaping a person from earth and breath feels like the ultimate craft story. But you also feel the modern itch to read it differently. A fringe idea proposes that phrases like mixing essence and shaping from clay are not poetic at all, but literal descriptions of bioengineering. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin. Still, it lingers because the imagery is vivid, and modern minds love to translate metaphor into mechanics. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic lens, a dim workshop that is actually a laboratory, a place where the first humans were assembled, tested, then discarded. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The ancient sources we have are mythic and literary, not technical manuals. The lab feeling is a modern projection. That's a possibility, not a certainty. You move deeper into the workshop and notice a rack of small clay molds. Some are shaped like simple discs, some like tiny figurines, some like abstract forms that might be weights or seals. You run a finger along the edge of one mold and feel the smoothness of repeated use. If you were making 100 identical objects, you would need molds. You would need standardization. A new development enters your mind, standardization as a kind of creation. When institutions standardize weights, measures, and forms, they create a shared reality. They make trade possible. They make administration possible. They also make people legible to power. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian societies developed systems of standardized measurement and record keeping. The evidence we do have points to a world increasingly organized through categories: worker, priest, king, artisan, debtor, foreigner. One interpretation is that the second creation is the moment humans become standardized within a system. The first creation is biological life. The second is social formatting. You spot a set of tiny weights on a shelf, each one carefully shaped. You pick one up. It is heavier than you expect. It is meant to be reliable. It does not argue with you. It does not change its mind. Honestly, you wish your emotions were like this weight. You laugh softly at yourself and set it down. You walk toward a corner where a scribe sits alone, not copying myths this time, but writing a list of ingredients. The signs are neat. The items are practical. Resin, oil, ash, perhaps medicinal plants. This is the kind of text that supports daily life. And now, the mystery part slips in through the side door. What if the ingredient lists, the ritual recipes, the medical instructions, are the closest thing to technical writing that survives? If you were determined to find a hidden story of engineered humanity, you might stare at these lists and imagine they are fragments of a larger formula. A popular rumor claims that certain ancient recipes were actually instructions for creating life. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it makes a bedtime image, a bowl of clay, a drop of something divine, a whispered word that acts like a switch. To be clear, this is debated and not confirmed. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You leave the scribe to their careful work and step into a small adjoining room. Here, the air is cooler. A stone basin holds water. A cloth is folded neatly beside it. The room feels like a place for cleansing, either for hygiene or ritual preparation. You wash your hands. The water is cool and makes your skin feel newly awake. You watch the clay residue swirl away. It reminds you how easily surfaces change, how quickly a trace can vanish. That becomes a gentle metaphor again. A first version can be removed without leaving obvious marks, especially if the world is designed to keep moving. Historians still argue whether the language of clay and blood in certain creation motifs should be interpreted as literal ritual symbolism, political allegory about labor, or deeper metaphors about human mortality. The debate line comes to rest like a quiet ripple in the basin. Now you look at the basin's surface and see your reflection, distorted slightly by the water. It looks like you, but not exactly. A second version of you. The image is calm, and it invites a new angle, duplication as reflection, not replacement. The created twice idea could be a poetic way of saying humans exist in two states. One is the physical body. The other is the social, named, recorded self. Or perhaps the mythic self, the one that stories describe. You step back into the main workshop and notice a clay figurine on the table. It is small, freshly formed, not yet fired. Someone has pressed tiny marks into its chest. Perhaps symbols, perhaps decorative lines. You pick it up gently. It is soft. It could be smoothed and reshaped. It could be flattened back into a lump. The potential feels huge in something so small. A careful reading might suggest that ancient people understood development as iterative. You do not bake a perfect pot on your first try. You do not weave a flawless textile without practice. You do not cure every illness. You adjust. You refine. That worldview makes it natural to imagine creation as iterative too. Now the cinematic what-if returns, softly. What if there really was a first attempt? Not a different species, not a separate world, but a first set of traits, too strong, too restless, too resistant. The gods, or the institutions that speak through gods, decide to refine the design. The second creation is a calmer temperament, a more predictable lifespan, a better fit for cities and ledgers. That is imagination, not fact. You set the figurine down and glance at the shelves again. There are amulets, little protective objects made of clay, stone, or metal. Some have inscriptions, some have simple shapes. The evidence we do have points to people using protective rituals and objects to manage fear and uncertainty. This is mainstream history. When life is fragile, people build small shields of meaning. One interpretation is that protection rituals might preserve older ideas about what humans are vulnerable to. If there was an older narrative about humanity being altered, weakened, or redesigned, it might survive as a protective tradition rather than a written headline. That's suggestive, not conclusive, but it's a plausible pathway for cultural memory. A fringe idea proposes that amulets and incantations were designed to counteract interference from non-human forces, the same forces that supposedly created or modified humanity. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it offers an eerie, cinematic mood without needing to claim certainty. The workshop becomes a defense station, mixing not just medicine, but spiritual firewall settings. Your sleepy joke sneaks in. Ancient people basically invented antivirus software, except instead of updates, you get incense. You sit on a low stool and listen to the quiet clinks and soft steps in the workshop. The lamp flame trembles. The air smells of resin and herbs. Everything feels slow, careful, human. Most historians agree that regardless of mythic framing, these societies were built by people doing real work, passing down skills and making meaning out of the materials around them. The evidence we do have points to astonishing ingenuity without requiring any supernatural explanation. And yet, you allow the mystery to exist as mist, as possibility. What if some myths are memories of being changed? Not necessarily by aliens, not necessarily by gods in a literal sense, but by the pressures of city life, by the demands of institutions, by the evolution of culture itself. In that reading, the second creation is the shaping of humanity by civilization, and the erasure is the slow fading of an older kind of human freedom. You stand and stretch gently. Your hands smell of herbs. Your mind feels calmer. The workshop feels like a lullaby made of tools and bowls. You walk out into the night, and the cool air meets your face like a clean sheet. Somewhere, a dog sighs and lies down. Somewhere, a lamp is snuffed. Somewhere, a person dreams of being remade into someone who fits more easily. And you, walking quietly under the stars, let that idea settle without forcing it. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Tonight, the bowls and molds are real. The laboratory vibe is a bedtime shadow. The double creation remains a puzzle, soft-edged and perfectly suited for sleep. You step into a city that feels like it has rebuilt itself so many times it no longer remembers what original means. The streets are layered. Some walls lean at odd angles because they were built onto older walls. Doorways sit half a step higher than the street, as if the ground rose in slow motion over generations. The air smells of lime plaster, smoke, and fresh-cut reeds. Even at night, you can hear quiet maintenance sounds, a distant hammer tap, a soft sweep of a broom, a bucket sloshing. This place does not sleep so much as it pauses. Archaeology suggests that many Mesopotamian cities were rebuilt repeatedly, with new buildings constructed atop older ruins, creating deep layers of occupation over time. What's broadly accepted is that these cycles of collapse and renewal could come from flooding, conflict, shifting trade routes, salinization of fields, political change, and plain old wear and tear. Solid ground, cities are living stacks of decisions. You walk past a section of wall where the bricks change color halfway up. Lower bricks are darker, older, more worn. Upper bricks look newer, brighter in the lamplight. You touch the seam between them. It feels like touching a timeline. Now a careful reading might suggest something important. When physical layers accumulate, social memory becomes layered too. People inherit a city that already contains secrets. Not hidden secrets like treasure maps, but structural secrets. Why is this street curved? Because a canal used to run here. Why is the temple facing that way? Because an older shrine once did. Why is this family's house near the gate? Because long ago their ancestors had a job that made that location useful. One interpretation is that creation stories can work like the brick seam you just touched. A newer story is built on older assumptions. The older assumptions remain, but they are no longer visible unless you know how to look. You turn a corner and see a line of men carrying baskets of rubble. They are clearing debris from a collapsed roof. Their movements are slow and steady, and their faces are calm, in the way people get calm when they've accepted that rebuilding is just part of life. A supervisor counts baskets, nods, and marks something on a small tablet. The sound of stylus on clay is soft, like a tiny insect tapping on wood. Most historians agree that record-keeping and labor coordination were central to Mesopotamian urban life, especially when rebuilding and maintenance were constant needs. The evidence we do have points to administrative systems tracking work, goods, and people. This is mainstream history, and it fits perfectly with the feeling of this city. Nothing survives without organization. Now the mystery balance slips in, but gently. What if the idea of the first humans were erased is actually an echo of urban erasure? When a city is rebuilt, older neighborhoods disappear, old street patterns vanish, names change. A family can be prominent in one century and forgotten in the next. In that sense, erasure is normal. Civilization is a machine that both preserves and deletes. You arrive at a public square where a stone basin sits in the center, used for water and rituals. The basin is cracked and repaired. A line of patch material runs across it like a scar. You run your fingers along the repair. Someone decided it was easier to fix than replace. That tells you something about resources and priorities. Now, a new development appears: lists of kings. In Mesopotamian tradition, king lists exist that organize rulers into sequences, sometimes with legendary figures and extraordinary reign lengths at the beginning, then more historically plausible reigns later. The mainstream point is that these lists are not simple chronicles. They can be political documents, theological statements, or memory tools. They often reflect ideology as much as history. One interpretation is that king lists can also function as selective storytelling, highlighting certain dynasties while minimizing others. That selectivity can feel like erasure, not necessarily malicious, but purposeful. A city wants to remember itself in a particular way. You walk into a building where a scribe is reciting names from a tablet to an apprentice. The apprentice repeats them, writing carefully. The names sound rhythmic, like a chant. You notice the pattern. This king, this city, this reign, this transfer of authority. It feels like a sacred genealogy of power. Historians still argue whether the earliest portions of king lists preserve distorted memories of real prehistoric leadership, or whether they are primarily mythic constructs designed to establish legitimacy for later rulers. The debate line settles over the recited names, and the room's lamp flame flickers as if it approves of uncertainty. You step outside again, and the night air feels cooler. The city's rooftops are uneven, like waves made of mud brick. You walk toward the edge where a canal channel glints faintly in starlight. The channel is narrower here, lined with stones and reed mats. A worker is repairing a small break in the bank with fresh clay, pressing it into place, smoothing the surface until it looks seamless. That action becomes a metaphor with a new twist. When you repair a bank, you erase the evidence of the break. You do it so water flows properly. You do it for survival. The repair is not lying. It is functioning. One interpretation is that myths and official histories sometimes do the same thing. They patch the narrative to keep social water flowing. They smooth over breaks that might cause conflict, doubt, or instability. In that reading, a first creation of humans might represent an older narrative that was patched over, not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient or too complex. A fringe idea proposes that the oldest, legendary sections of king lists hint at non-human rulers or off-world dynasties. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence is thin, but it persists in modern speculation because the early reign lengths are so extraordinary. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic mood, a time when kingship is not just political office, but something stranger, and the humans living under it might feel like a first version of humanity, later rewritten when history becomes more grounded. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Extraordinary reign lengths in ancient lists are typically understood by scholars as mythic or symbolic, not literal historical record. The speculative reading is missed, not solid ground. You walk along the canal and notice small house shrines tucked into corners. In one, a clay figurine sits beside a tiny bowl. In another, a simple symbol is painted on plaster. These are not state rituals. They are household rituals, private, repetitive, and quiet. The evidence we do have points to domestic religion and personal protective practices being common, even when state cults dominated public life. Now the story takes a new development into the realm of names again, but at the household level. A mother whispers a name over a sleeping child. A father traces a protective sign on a doorway. These names and signs may never appear in a king list. They may never be written on a monument. They exist in breath, in habit, in small gestures. One interpretation is that if there was an older idea of human origins, it might survive in domestic ritual rather than official texts, not as a clear narrative, but as a feeling. We were made, remade, protected, and shaped by forces bigger than ourselves. That feeling can persist, even when the official story changes. You pause and listen to the city. It is quiet, but not empty. Somewhere, someone is singing softly while working, the kind of tune that keeps hands steady. Somewhere, someone laughs in a courtyard, a short burst of warmth that fades quickly. Somewhere, a baby cries and is soothed. The city's constant rebuilding begins to feel like a second creation in itself. Not once, but repeatedly. Walls collapse and rise again. Canals break and are patched. Names are remembered and forgotten. The people living now are the latest version of the city, shaped by everything that came before, even if they cannot see it. What if the first humans were erased in the same way old streets are erased? Not destroyed in a single event, but gradually buried beneath new construction. The second humans are the ones who live on top, believing their ground is solid, not realizing it is a layered archive. To be clear, that's interpretation and imagination, not a documented claim. But it fits the physical reality archaeology reveals. Layers upon layers, the past literally underfoot. You walk toward a mound at the edge of the city, where the ground rises gently. At the top, you can see the river line in the distance, the dark strip of fields, the scattered lights of villages. The stars above feel steady, and the city below feels like a slow breathing creature. You sit and rest your hands on your knees. The night breeze cools your face. Your thoughts slow. Most historians agree that ancient urban life involved cycles of continuity and change, with traditions maintained even as political powers shifted. The evidence we do have points to resilience, adaptation, and a constant negotiation with the environment. That is the mainstream truth, and it is already enough to feel like a miracle. Now the misty what if comes in like a lullaby. What if the idea of being created twice is not a single mythic event, but a sensation built into city life? You are born, and then you are made again by the city's systems. You are shaped by rules, lists, measures, and obligations. The first you is raw, the second you is formatted. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine the city like a tablet being rewritten. The surface is smoothed, the signs pressed in again and again. Some impressions remain faintly underneath, like ghosts of earlier lines. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You breathe slowly. The city keeps quiet maintenance sounds in the distance, and your mind, soothed by the idea of layers and gentle erasures, begins to drift toward sleep like a lamp flame lowering itself, not out of fear, but out of simple, natural rest. You walk into a landscape that feels scorched, not in the sense of smoking ruins, but in the sense of a place that has been pushed too hard and has not fully forgiven anyone. The ground is pale and crusted in patches, as if salt has crept up from below and decided to live there rent-free. The air is dry, carrying dust that tastes faintly bitter, far off. You can see fields that look tired, their edges frayed by neglect or strain. A wind moves across the land and makes a low, steady sound, like the world is humming to itself to stay calm. Archaeology suggests that parts of southern Mesopotamia faced long-term environmental challenges, including salinization of irrigated soils, shifting river courses, and pressure from intensive agriculture. What's broadly accepted is that these stresses could contribute to economic strain and political instability. Solid ground. Sometimes the enemy is not an army, but chemistry. You follow an irrigation channel that runs shallow. The water is there, but it seems reluctant, as if it knows it will be demanded to do too much. A farmer stands near the bank, inspecting the flow, rubbing soil between his fingers. He frowns, then shrugs in the universal human gesture of, "I will do what I can, but I cannot argue with physics." Now, the story takes on the motif of conflict, but not only the dramatic kind. In Mesopotamian myths, divine conflict often appears as a way of explaining why the world is difficult. Cosmic battles, rivalries, decrees, the reshuffling of power. Most historians agree that these mythic conflicts are literary and theological narratives, not straightforward historical reporting. Yet, the emotional truth can still reflect real human experiences of competition, invasion, and systemic breakdown. One interpretation is that the final war feeling in myth can encode periods of upheaval, when familiar structures collapse and new ones rise. Wars between cities, struggles for kingship, foreign incursions, internal rebellion, famine, and environmental pressure can all be folded into a mythic language of gods clashing. You walk toward the remains of a boundary wall, low and broken. Stones lie scattered like teeth. A watchtower stands half collapsed, its silhouette jagged against the stars. You climb the rubble carefully and look out. The horizon feels wide and empty. In the distance, faint lights suggest another settlement, another group of people trying to hold order together. A careful reader might suggest that when myths talk about the gods making decisions after conflict, they are also talking about people rewriting the rules after crisis. New laws, new treaties, new rituals, new social categories. And that brings the double creation concept into a new form. Humanity redesigned to endure the new world. Now, we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Documented anchor. Mesopotamian societies experience cycles of conflict and reorganization, and myths often reflect themes of order emerging from chaos. Interpreted angle. The second creation could symbolize a new social contract after upheaval, a redesigned human role within a revised system. Imagined what if? You picture the land itself changed by a mythic war, and humans adjusted like tools reforged to survive. Historians still argue whether certain dramatic mythic motifs should be read primarily as reflections of political history, as theological statements about divine authority, or as literary art designed to be performed and remembered. The debate line settles into the dry wind, and the wind keeps humming. You climb down and walk toward a small camp where soldiers rest. Not a huge army, just a handful of men with spears and shields, their gear leaning against a low wall. They are tired. Their faces are dusty. They eat quietly, like people who have learned that boasting wastes energy. A cook stirs a pot that smells like onions and grain. The smell is comforting, almost shockingly normal for a place that feels tense. One soldier sharpens a blade with a stone, the sound steady and soothing. It is not a violent sound. It is maintenance. He is preparing for possibility, not celebrating it. Your sleepy joke pops up gently. Even ancient warriors had to do their chores, which means nobody has ever escaped the tyranny of upkeep. You sit near the edge of the camp and listen to their low conversation. They talk about water access, about the condition of roads, about whether a certain village will pay tribute or resist. The stakes are real, but the talk is practical. In that practicality, you feel how conflict is often less about drama and more about logistics. Now the mystery angle returns in a careful way. A fringe idea proposes that divine war language might preserve memories of technological or catastrophic events that ancient people could only describe in mythic terms. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence is thin. Still, it can be explored as a bedtime possibility, a sky event, an unusual storm, a meteor, a plague, or some other disruption reimagined as a war among gods. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Extraordinary descriptions in ancient texts do not automatically indicate extraordinary technologies. They often indicate extraordinary feelings. The speculative reading is missed, not conclusion. You step away from the camp and walk toward a dried-out channel where cracked mud forms geometric patterns. The patterns look like a map, like the earth is drawing its own cuneiform. You crouch and trace a crack with your finger. The edges are sharp and dry. This land has known thirst. One interpretation is that when the world becomes harsher, societies become stricter, rules tighten, hierarchies harden, people become more dependent on institutions for survival. In such a world, a myth about humanity being remade makes emotional sense. The second creation is the human shaped by scarcity, trained to obey systems that promise stability. Now, the cinematic what-if comes in softly. What if the first humans, in a mythic sense, belonged to a more abundant world, where water flowed freely and the soil was forgiving? Then the environment shifts. The rivers change course. Salt builds up. The fields yield less. The world feels like it has been damaged by a war, whether literal or metaphorical. The story responds by imagining a redesign. Humans made again, with a different temperament, different boundaries, different limits. You stand and look at the stars. The sky feels cold and far. You can see why ancient people treated it like a realm of decisions beyond human control. When your survival depends on rain and river and wind, you naturally imagine higher forces shaping your fate. A new development enters the story, endurance as the goal. In some mythic frameworks, humanity is created not just to work, but to sustain cosmic order through ritual. In a crisis world, that becomes more intense. Ritual becomes a way to hold back chaos. Work becomes devotion. Endurance becomes holiness. You walk toward a small shrine built beside a road. It is simple: a stone platform, a clay bowl, a soot-darkened niche where a lamp can burn. Someone has left a pinch of grain. Someone has left a small bead. People ask the divine for stability, and they do it with whatever they can spare. Most historians agree that ritual practice was woven into daily life, and that people sought divine support in uncertain times. The evidence we do have points to widespread use of offerings, prayers, and protective gestures. This is mainstream and human. When the world feels unstable, you look for anchors. Now the mystery theory element can connect without misleading. What if the Anunnaki's final war motif, as modern audiences imagine it, is really a stitched-together atmosphere made from many ancient conflict themes: cosmic rivalry, flood resets, kingship struggles, environmental stress? In that stitched atmosphere, the idea of a second human design feels like a natural conclusion. Not necessarily true, but narratively satisfying. A popular rumor claims that ancient people encoded warnings about future disasters into their myths, and that the double creation story is a clue about adaptation. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it can be treated as a possibility. Myths as cautionary tales, urging societies to change before they break. You walk along the road and notice footprints in dust, some fresh, some fading. A child's small print beside an adult's larger one, a donkey hoof print, a cartwheel mark. Life continues even when the landscape feels stressed. That persistence feels like the real miracle. You reach a village where houses are lower and more defensive, clustered close. People here watch strangers carefully. They are not hostile, just cautious. A woman pours water into a jar with a careful hand, as if every drop matters. A man repairs a gate hinge. A boy chases a chicken and loses, which is a timeless human experience. The chicken wins with smug confidence. You sit in the village square and let the quiet settle. You realize the double creation idea can be read as a story about adaptation. The first humans are the ones who live in a softer world. The second humans are the ones who learn to survive in a harder one. The erasure is not a literal deletion, but the fading of the old way of living, replaced by new habits, new rules, new endurance. Historians still argue whether major shifts in Mesopotamian power and settlement patterns were driven more by environmental change, internal political dynamics, external invasions, or complex interactions among all these factors. You let the debate line land again, because history is rarely a single cause story. The night deepens, the village quiets, lamps go out one by one, the wind softens. You lie down on a woven mat in a courtyard, looking up at the stars through a gap between walls. The sky is calm. Your breathing slows. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Tonight, the stressed land is real. The cosmic war is myth language. The second creation is a way of imagining resilience. You close your eyes, and the world's dry hum becomes a lullaby that tells you the same thing over and over in a soothing voice. Adapt, endure, rest. You arrive at a place where the city sounds fade into a softer, more personal quiet, like the difference between a crowded street and your own bedroom when the door clicks shut. The air is cooler here. The ground is smoother, swept clean. A small courtyard opens under the stars, and in the center sits a simple altar table. Not grand, not intimidating, just steady. A clay lamp burns with a small flame that barely moves, as if it has learned the art of staying calm. The evidence we do have points to long-lived ritual practice in Mesopotamia, with daily offerings, hymns, and protective customs woven into ordinary life. Most historians agree that many people experience the divine not mainly through epic stories, but through routine, lighting lamps, offering food, speaking names, keeping order in the home. This is solid ground, and it matters because it reminds you that even the biggest myths ultimately land in small, repeated actions. You sit on a low bench and listen to the courtyard. You can hear distant water somewhere, maybe a canal, maybe a well. You can hear an occasional soft footstep, someone moving quietly so they do not wake the whole neighborhood. You can hear your own breath, and it feels like it belongs here, slow and steady. Now, a careful reading might suggest that the idea of two creations can live comfortably inside ritual life. One creation is the act of being made, the origin story told in myth. The second creation is the act of being maintained, day after day, by habits and rules and protective gestures. In that sense, humanity is continually remade, not by a dramatic event, but by a gentle repetition. One interpretation is that this is why the first humanity erased theme can feel emotionally true even when the evidence is not explicit. The first version is what you are before you learn the rules. The second version is what you become after life shapes you. The erasure is the soft fading of the raw edges, the smoothing of clay by time, duty, and community. Historians still argue whether ancient rituals should be understood primarily as expressions of belief, as tools of social cohesion, or as practical responses to uncertainty in fragile environments. You let the debate line settle like dust in lamplight, and you keep your mind gentle. Tonight is not about forcing a conclusion. Tonight is about letting the puzzle remain a puzzle. A priest enters the courtyard, but this one feels less like an official and more like a caretaker. He carries a small bowl of grain and a tiny jug of oil. He does not speak loudly. He does not perform for an audience. He simply does the work. He pours a little oil into the lamp, and the flame steadies. He places a pinch of grain on the altar table. The gesture is small, but it carries a sense of continuity that stretches far beyond this courtyard. A fringe idea proposes that rituals like this might preserve older knowledge in symbolic form, like a coded memory that survives when words and tablets fail. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin, but it is a gentle possibility. Perhaps certain gestures, certain sequences, certain repeated phrases are cultural fossils from older narratives, including the idea of a first human attempt that did not last. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Ritual continuity can preserve old patterns, but it does not automatically prove a specific hidden history. The safer mainstream view is that rituals endure because they meet human needs: comfort, order, identity, community. Still, you allow the what if to hover like the lamp's glow. What if some gestures are older than the stories that currently explain them? What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the erased first version of humanity is not a separate species, but a memory of a different way of being human? One that felt closer to the wild river and less bound to the city's rules. You look at the altar table and notice small marks scratched into its surface. Maybe tally marks, maybe a simple symbol. They are worn, softened by touch. Someone traced them again and again. The marks remind you of how meaning can be built through repetition, like a path worn into earth. Most historians agree that myths and rituals coexisted, reinforcing each other. The evidence we do have points to temples and households both participating in a shared sacred framework, even if the details varied by city and time. In that shared framework, humanity's role often centers on keeping the world stable through offerings and proper conduct. Now, a new development arrives, and it feels like the quiet heart of the whole idea. Perhaps the twice-created concept is not about a single origin moment, but about a tension between two definitions of human purpose. One definition is broad and open, humans as living beings with desires, families, curiosity, laughter, and mistakes. The other definition is narrow and functional, humans as maintainers of divine order, workers who keep temples running and rituals correct. One interpretation is that the first definition is what gets erased when institutions grow strong. The second definition becomes official. The first does not vanish completely, because you cannot erase hunger, love, humor, and stubbornness. But it can be pushed into private spaces, into songs, into jokes, into the way people whisper their hopes when nobody important is listening. You smile softly at that, because it feels true in a human way. Also, you know institutions in every era have tried to define people by function, and people in every era have quietly refused to be only that. Your small joke lands gently. Even ancient empires could not stop people from being weird in their own homes. You stand and walk to the edge of the courtyard, where a small garden patch grows, fed by careful watering, a few herbs, a little onion, maybe a fig sapling. The soil is darker here, protected from the salty crust of harsher fields. Someone has created a tiny pocket of fertility, like a private promise. Archaeology suggests that household spaces were vital centers of daily life, and that many religious practices were domestic, not only monumental. That mainstream point is calming. It means history is not just kings and wars and grand myths. It is also families, meals, lamps, and gardens. Now the mystery balance returns without turning into certainty. A popular rumor claims that the Anunnaki story is a coded account of human alteration, with an earlier version removed and a second version released, like a cosmic update. This theory isn't widely accepted, yet as a bedtime idea. It can be held lightly, not a conclusion, but a poetic way of saying humans have always felt shaped by forces beyond their control, whether those forces are gods, rulers, environment, or time. You sit again and watch the lamp flame. It is small, but it makes the shadows soft. The courtyard walls hold the night at a comfortable distance. You realize the most soothing part of this story is not the mystery itself, but the permission to live with uncertainty. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The documented part is that Mesopotamian people built cities, dug canals, wrote on clay, told myths, and practiced rituals. The interpretation is that myths may reflect social change and institutional needs. The imagination is the cinematic idea of a first humanity that did not last, a draft smoothed away. Now the pacing slows even more, like the world is lowering its volume. The priest has left. The courtyard is empty, except for you, and the lamp, and the quiet. You let your shoulders drop. You let your jaw unclench. You let your hands rest loosely, palms warm against your legs. You listen for distant sounds, and you notice how few there are now. A soft rustle of leaves, a faint trickle of water, a quiet cough from a nearby house. Then nothing. You imagine clay in your hands, cool and forgiving. You imagine pressing it gently, shaping it without rush. You imagine smoothing away rough edges, not to erase yourself, but to make yourself comfortable. You imagine that if there were two creations, the second one is not a punishment, but an adjustment, a softer fit between you and the world. You breathe in slow and deep, and you breathe out even slower. The lamp flame trembles, then steadies, as if it is breathing with you. You think, in the gentlest way, about the idea of an erased first version. You do not picture fear. You picture quiet revision. You picture the way a potter reshapes a rim to keep it from cracking. You picture the way a gardener trims a leaf to help a plant grow. You picture the way a story changes in the telling, not because someone is lying, but because someone is trying to make meaning out of life. The night feels kind. The stars feel far away and harmless. The courtyard feels safe. Your eyelids grow heavier, and you let them. You let the last thoughts soften into simple images. A lamp, a bowl of grain, a small garden patch, a calm breath. You let the world be ancient and present at the same time, as if time is just another layer of clay, and you are resting on the smoothest part of it. And as the lamp flame lowers itself, you let yourself lower too, sinking into sleep the way a stone sinks into warm sand, leaving no struggle, only a gentle settling. End of script. Sweet dreams.